Imagine this. It's still dark in Lomé, the capital of Togo. At 5 a.m., neighbors watch in silence as over 30 armed soldiers surround the home of a woman, not a rebel leader, not a foreign spy, a woman, her name, Margarite Nakad. But this is no ordinary arrest, because Nakad isn't just another critic of the government. She's the former Minister of Defense. She's the sister-in-law of President Faure Gnassingbé himself. And here's the danger: she once had the loyalty of Togo's military. For nearly 6 decades since 1967, the Gnassingbe family dynasty has ruled Togo with an iron grip longer even than the Kim dynasty in North Korea. Power passed from father to son, constitutions rewritten, elections bent. And yet, this arrest on September 17, 2025 may mark the first crack in the foundation of a 58-year regime. Because Nakad did something few dared to do, she called openly on soldiers to abandon the family dynasty and stand with the people. And security sources now admit her words have caused general discomfort in the barracks. This is no longer just about one woman's arrest. It's about the possibility of Togo leaving ECOWAS, joining the Alliance of Sahel states, and handing Russia and China control of a strategic Atlantic port. It's about the collapse of France's last dependable ally in the region. It's about whether Africa's old dynasties can still survive in an age when even artists and rappers can spark revolutions. So tonight we ask, is Togo about to follow Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger into a new political future? Will the dynasty of Faure Gnassingbé finally fall? And if Togo flips, what will it mean for the balance of power in all of West Africa? Please share if you feel that you are witnessing history unfold. And subscribe if you believe that Africa's truth should be heard beyond the headlines. For most of the world, Togo is a small dot on the West African map. But inside its borders lies one of the longest-lasting political dynasties on Earth. Since 1967, the Gnassingbé family has ruled with near-total control. What began with a military coup by General Gnassingbe Eyadema hardened into a system that lasted almost 60 years, outliving the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and nearly every other dictatorship in the region. Eyadema's rule stretched from 1967 to 2005, 38 years of iron fist leadership. When he died suddenly on a flight to Tunis, it wasn't the people who chose his successor, it was the army. Soldiers simply installed his son Faure Gnassingbé into power overnight, and from that moment, the dynasty entered its second chapter. At first, Faure tried to present himself as a modernizer. He spoke the language of reform. He promised free elections, economic growth, and a gentler form of leadership. But as the years passed, the pattern became clear. Promises of reform faded. Elections were marked by intimidation and accusations of fraud. And by 2025, Faure faced a problem every autocrat eventually encounters: time. His constitutional term limits were about to run out. That's when he pulled off what many now call the most sophisticated coup in West Africa, not with tanks, but with paperwork. In April 2025, Togo's parliament voted to change the very structure of government. The presidency, once the seat of power, was stripped down to a ceremonial role. A new office was created, President of the Council of Ministers. It sounds technical. But here's the twist: this position carries the true executive power. And unlike the presidency, it has no term limits at all. By May 2025, Faure Gnassingbé quietly slid into that new role. On paper, everything looked legal. There were no gunshots, no soldiers storming TV stations, no dramatic takeover. Instead, the coup unfolded under the cover of constitutional reform. Faure had found a way to rule indefinitely, dictatorship disguised as democracy. The genius, or perhaps the cruelty, of this move lies in how it was carried out. The parliament that approved these sweeping reforms had already expired. Its mandate ended back in December 2023, but Faure kept it in place, using an institution without legitimacy to pass changes that would guarantee his own survival. The opposition tried to challenge it in the ECOWAS court, but by then, the trap had already closed. Internationally, the move drew little backlash. Unlike the military coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, which triggered sanctions and condemnation, Faure's constitutional coup seemed respectable. Western partners grumbled, but they didn't cut ties. France, the EU, and even the US treated it as business as usual. After all, no soldiers had marched on the palace. It was just democratic reform, on the surface at least. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. Ordinary Togolese could see through the charade. They knew this was not reform, but consolidation. That their votes had been sidelined, their parliament hijacked, and their future stolen. Street protests began to grow louder, led not by political elites, but by young voices, artists, and activists. The most famous among them was a 26-year-old rapper named Amran, whose satirical songs about corruption struck a nerve with Togo's restless youth. To many Togolese, Amran's lyrics captured what they had long felt, that the system was built to serve one family while everyone else struggled with inflation, joblessness, and daily insecurity. His music became an anthem of resistance. And for the first time, Faure's carefully built facade began to wobble. Faure believed his constitutional trick had guaranteed another generation of family rule. But history has a way of exposing even the most clever schemes. By mid-2025, it was no longer just about laws or positions on paper. The streets of Lomé were filling with smoke, the youth were marching, and soldiers were quietly asking themselves if loyalty to one family was worth more than loyalty to the nation. The Gnassingbe dynasty had survived coups, assassinations, and international isolation. But as this constitutional coup unfolded, it became clear the greatest threat to its survival might not come from foreign powers, but from within Togo itself, its people, its artists, and eventually even its own military. The crack in Togo's iron wall didn't come from a general or a foreign ally. It came from a rapper. His name was Chala Esoy Nasi, better known by his stage name Amran. Just 26 years old with a gift for satire and rhythm, Amran became the voice of a restless generation. His songs mocked the president's endless rule, laughed at corruption, and captured the frustrations of ordinary youth who saw no future in a country locked under one family's grip. On May 26, 2025, Amran released a satirical video calling for a celebration on the president's birthday, a joke, but one that struck a nerve. Within hours, security forces stormed his home in Lomé and dragged him away. For more than a week, he vanished. His family had no idea whether he was alive or dead. Then, on June 5th, a video appeared. Amran sat before the camera visibly distressed. His voice was flat, his body language broken. In the recording, he begged forgiveness, admitting that he had used insulting and outrageous words against the president. The government claimed he had been treated for depression in a psychiatric hospital. But nobody believed that story. People could see the truth. This was not therapy. This was coercion. Torture hidden behind the mask of medicine. That video, meant to terrify, had the opposite effect. Across Togo, young people shared it on phones, in cafes, on street corners. They whispered the same thought: if they can break Amran, they can break any of us. What was supposed to be a warning became a rallying cry. By June 6th, the streets of Lomé erupted. Thousands poured out, blocking roads with burning tires, hurling stones, facing down tear gas. The air filled with smoke and the sting of chemicals. Protesters carried hand-painted signs demanding the release of political prisoners and the end of the dynasty. This wasn't a carefully organized opposition march. It was raw anger, decades of humiliation spilling into the open. The government's response was swift and brutal. Riot police flooded the streets with military trucks firing live rounds into crowds. Baton-wielding officers beat anyone within reach. Tear gas canisters rolled into homes and shops, choking families inside. Over 3 days, at least 7 people were confirmed dead. Civil society groups reported finding bodies in rivers near the capital, though the government claimed they were drowning victims. The true horror unfolded in detention centers. Amnesty International later documented testimonies of over 60 protesters who had been tortured. Victims described being forced to lie face down while officers poured water over them and beat them with cables on their backs and feet. Others were humiliated, forced to sing into dead microphones or dance in the rain while guards mocked them. Some were pressured to sign papers they could not read. Medical records confirmed the injuries, swollen limbs, torn muscles, burns, and trauma that lingered long after release. For Togolese youth, this was not just an attack on individuals. It felt like an assault on their culture itself. In West Africa, music and satire have always been tools of truth-telling. Griots and storytellers stood up to kings long before parliaments or elections existed. By forcing Amran into a false apology, the regime was trying to silence that ancient tradition. Instead, it gave it new life. The protests shook the capital for 72 hours. Roads were blocked, Smoke rose from barricades. Crowds chanted slogans of freedom even as tear gas stung their lungs. The government may have regained control of the streets, but something irreversible had happened. The fear barrier had cracked, and this was only the beginning. Just weeks later, the regime struck again, rearresting Amran on charges of inciting a popular uprising and calling for military revolt. The message was clear: no one, not even the country's most beloved young artist, was beyond the reach of repression. But each arrest only deepened the anger. By the time Margarite Nakad, the president's own sister-in-law, called publicly on soldiers to abandon the dynasty, the ground had already shifted. Amran's broken voice had done what decades of opposition leaders could not awaken a generation. The dynasty was still in power, but for the first time in 58 years, it was fighting to survive not against foreign enemies, but against its own people, armed not with guns, but with song, satire, and the courage to defy fear. By late 2025, Togo was no longer the quiet coastal state many outsiders assumed it to be. The arrest of Amran, the brutal repression of protests, and finally the dramatic detention of Margarite Nakad had left the country shaken to its core. For ordinary citizens, the events carried consequences that reached into their daily lives, reshaping both society and politics. On the streets, fear was everywhere. Families who had lost sons and daughters in the June protests carried grief like a shadow. Mothers whispered to each other in marketplaces, warning their children not to join demonstrations. Fathers kept their teenage boys home, afraid they would vanish into the back of a police truck. Yet beneath the fear, something else was growing: anger mixed with defiance. Citizens who once avoided politics were now discussing the dynasty openly. Taxi drivers, shopkeepers, and even teachers spoke of how long one family could cling to power while the economy suffocated them all. The economic pressure was relentless. Inflation gnawed at salaries. Military families, once considered loyal pillars of the regime, struggled to afford food and school fees. Soldiers quietly asked themselves why they were defending a system that delivered so little in return. The very institution that kept the dynasty alive, military loyalty, was beginning to wobble under the weight of hunger and disillusion. Politically, the arrest of Margarite Nakad cut deeper than any street protest. As a former defense minister and the widow of Faure's brother, she embodied the dynasty's inner circle. Her open call for the army to stand with the people shattered the illusion of family unity. If even insiders were turning against the president, what did that say about his grip on power? Opposition groups immediately rallied around her, portraying Nakad as the bridge between civilian dissent and military unrest. Inside Parliament, the so-called reforms of 2025 were already losing legitimacy. Citizens mocked the new Council of Ministers as nothing more than a throne for four dressed up in legal language. Lawyers and civil society groups decried the fact that expired lawmakers had been used to ram through constitutional changes. To many, this confirmed what they had long suspected: the system was not a democracy at all, but a monarchy in disguise. Internationally, the fallout was complicated. ECOWAS, the regional bloc, found itself in crisis. It had condemned military coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, but now it faced something different: a constitutional coup. On paper, Faure's moves were legal, leaving ECOWAS unable to respond decisively. Yet, at the same time, more than half of Togolese citizens were voicing support for leaving ECOWAS altogether and joining the Alliance of Sahel states. Civil society organizations published polls showing 54% in favor of the switch. For the first time, Togo's alignment was in question. On the ground, this debate carried real weight. Traders and truck drivers at the port of Lomé whispered about how joining the Sahel bloc could reshape business. Students debated whether the future lay with the West or with Russia and China, who were now visible in the capital. The regime's attempt to maintain the status quo had instead unleashed a national conversation about sovereignty, loyalty, and survival. The political consequences extended even into the barracks. Security sources admitted to general discomfort among soldiers. That phrase, cold, bureaucratic, and vague, was in reality code for something far more dangerous: cracks in the chain of command. African history has shown that when armies hesitate, regimes collapse quickly. The fate of the dynasty now rested not on constitutional tricks, but on whether captains and colonels would obey their orders tomorrow morning. For ordinary citizens, the message was clear. Their lives had been altered by fear, grief, and scarcity. But their voices, whether through music protest or whispered conversations, were reshaping the nation's destiny. Politically, the dynasty's aura of invincibility was shattered. What had once seemed permanent now looked fragile, even temporary. The arrest of one rapper and one sister-in-law had done what decades of opposition failed to achieve. It turned Togo's future into an open question. And that uncertainty was both terrifying and liberating for a people who had lived under the same family for nearly 60 years. From Washington to Paris, from Moscow to Beijing, the crisis in Togo is more than a domestic affair. It is a test case for the struggle over Africa's future. What happens in Lomé could redraw the map of influence across the entire region. For the United States, Togo has long been a quiet partner, rarely in the headlines, but strategically important. American officials have supported ECOWAS as the primary stabilizing force in West Africa. But with Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger already defecting to the Alliance of Sahel States AS, the potential loss of Togo would be a devastating blow. If the AES gains access to the deep-water port of Lomé, 3 landlocked Sahel countries suddenly control their own gateway to the Atlantic. For U.S. strategists, this means not only a logistical nightmare, but also a symbolic defeat. America's model of democracy and regional security would be bypassed by a bloc openly aligned with Russia and China. France faces an even sharper reckoning. Togo has been one of Paris's last dependable allies on the Atlantic coast. Already expelled from Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, France has watched its influence shrink to a fraction of what it once was. Losing Togo would mean losing access to critical shipping routes and the final nail in the coffin for its post-colonial presence in the Sahel. French newspapers warn of a geopolitical disaster while diplomats scramble to persuade Faure Gnassingbé to hold the line. Yet every act of repression in Lomé erodes France's credibility, further fueling the narrative that Paris stands with dictators rather than with people. Russia, by contrast, sees opportunity. Since 2022, Russian advisors have quietly built relationships in Togo, selling helicopters and small arms, even helping establish a military base near the Burkina Faso border. In 2025, Moscow secured permission to open an embassy in Lomé, signaling its intent to anchor influence on the Atlantic coast. For the Kremlin, Togo is more than a small state. It is a corridor to maritime power and a chance to fracture Western alliances. China, too, has moved with precision. It elevated ties with Togo to the level of a comprehensive strategic partnership, Beijing's highest form of diplomatic recognition. Investments in infrastructure and trade flow through Lomé, giving China both economic leverage and political goodwill. Unlike Western powers, China avoids condemning Faure's constitutional maneuvers, preferring quiet deals that guarantee long-term influence. At the level of global competition, Togo's crisis exposes 2 competing visions. On one side, the West insists on defending ECOWAS rule of law and constitutional order, yet struggles to explain why it tolerates a dynasty that rewrote its constitution to last forever. On the other side, AES leaders frame themselves as champions of sovereignty, willing to break old ties and embrace new ones. To young Africans, the latter vision carries an appeal the West seems unable to match. For ordinary Americans and Europeans, the story of Togo may seem distant. But in a world where shipping routes define markets and alliances, decide wars, the fall of one dynasty on the West African coast could reverberate globally. If Togo shifts, the Atlantic may no longer be a western lake. Instead, it could become the front line of a new multipolar order, one where Russia and China hold as much sway in Lomé as Washington or Paris ever did. The story of Togo is not only about one family's grip on power, it is about the fate of an entire region standing at a crossroads. On one side lies the familiar path, dynasties clinging to power through fear, repression, and constitutional tricks. On the other side lies the uncertain road of change, youth rising armies questioning orders, and nations daring to imagine sovereignty beyond the shadow of Paris or Washington. But history teaches us something sobering. When dynasties collapse, they rarely fall quietly. They fall violently, shaking the foundations of society and leaving ordinary people to pick up the pieces. Already 7 young lives have been lost in the streets of Lomé. Families mourn without justice. Protesters carry scars that will not heal easily. And yet they march on, believing that the price of silence is heavier than the price of resistance. This is where the danger widens. If Togo joins the Sahel Alliance, the map of West Africa changes overnight. Ports shift, alliances harden, Western influence shrinks. Russia and China step forward, and what begins as a local protest could ripple into the great power rivalry of our age. America, already struggling with its own crises, may find itself asking, how much does West Africa matter to us? Now, how long can we afford to look away? For those of us watching from afar, this is more than foreign news. It is a mirror. Do we still believe in democracy when it is inconvenient? Do we still support sovereignty when it does not serve our own interests? Or do we allow the next 60 years in Africa to be shaped by others while we turn the page? So I leave you with these questions. Do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's reforms in Burkina Faso are proof that military-backed change can succeed where dynasties fail? If Togo flips to the Sahel Alliance, will this accelerate the collapse of Western influence across Africa or spark a new Cold War on the Atlantic coast? Please share if you feel you are among the first to witness this turning point in African history. And subscribe if you believe the truth must be told, because headlines fade, but the reality shaping Africa today will define the world our grandchildren inherit tomorrow.